fluorescent lights of St. Mercy Hospital never fully illuminate the corners. I've learned this during my 3 years working night shifts in this aging building. Shadows grow teeth after midnight. Sounds travel differently through the empty corridors, distorted and stretched like taffy pulled too thin. The rational part of my brain, the part that completed medical school with honors, knows there are explanations for everything. Old pipes groaning, ventilation systems cycling on and off, the natural settling of a structure built in 1932. But rationality fades with the daylight, leaving only instinct and the primitive fear of what lurks beyond the reach of our understanding. The first time it happened, I was completing rounds on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. A soft click echoed from the medication room, the unmistakable sound of a door latch releasing. I froze, clipboard pressed against my chest, watching as the door swung open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The nurse's station was empty. I was alone on the floor, save for the 3 elderly patients sleeping in their rooms. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the doorway, each step heavier than the last. The light switch refused to work. My pen light revealed only empty shelves and supply cabinets. No draft could have opened that locked door. I convinced myself it was fatigue playing tricks on my perception, until I saw it moving at the end of the hallway, a small darting figure that vanished around the corner before I could process what I was seeing. The security guard later insisted there were no unauthorized persons in the building. The patient census confirmed what I already knew. No patients under 60 years old were currently admitted. Weeks passed, and I wasn't the only one. Rodriguez from orthopedics mentioned offhandedly how he'd seen someone small running through radiology after hours. Chen from emergency confessed she'd stopped taking overnight shifts after repeatedly sensing a presence watching her from doorways. Whispers spread through the break room. How the overnight cleaning staff refused to work alone. How the 3rd floor had unusually high staff turnover. The shared experiences should have provided comfort. Instead, my skin crawled with the confirmation that something was wrong with St. Mercy. The staff lodging became another hotspot of inexplicable occurrences. I woke one night to the sensation of my bed sliding several inches across the floor, the metal frame scraping against tile. My body was rigid, sweat-soaked sheets twisted around my legs despite the room's chill. The air felt charged, as if a storm was brewing indoors. My mouth was desert dry as I whispered a question to the darkness, asking who was there. Silence answered, but not emptiness. The room felt occupied by something waiting, watching. The administration ignored our reports. Budget cuts had left the hospital understaffed, and management was more concerned with keeping bodies on shift than addressing ghost stories. My requests to research the hospital's history were met with thinly veiled warnings about my employment status. It was during my 15th consecutive night shift, against all safety protocols, that exhaustion and desperation drove me to the abandoned wing of the hospital's 5th floor. The old pediatric ward had been closed for renovations that never materialized due to funding issues. The double doors were secured with a chain, but the small maintenance access beside them had been left unlocked. My flashlight cut through dust-filled air as I entered what felt like a time capsule. Faded cartoon characters on peeling walls, rusted bed frames, and forgotten equipment. The administrative office yielded nothing until I noticed a discolored rectangle on the wall. Something had hung there for decades before being removed. Behind a filing cabinet, I found what I was looking for, a framed photograph from 1977 showing the hospital's staff and special residents. My fingers trembled as I wiped away the dust. In the center stood a small figure, no taller than a child, but with the wizened face of someone much older. According to the plaque, this was Thomas Winters, age 42, a long-term resident with a rare condition that halted his physical growth. Something about his eyes in the photograph made my stomach clench. They were too aware, too intelligent, too angry for the cheerful hospital photo. Records indicated Winters had been a resident for nearly 30 years before the hospital transitioned away from long-term care. He'd been transferred to a specialized facility where he reportedly passed away within months, though I found no death certificate in the system. That night, returning to my regular rounds, every shadow seemed to pulse with new significance. The doors began opening and closing with increasing frequency, no longer just at night, but during day shifts as well. The small figure appeared more boldly, lingering just long enough for me to catch details. Outdated hospital garments, unusual proportions, and once, a glimpse of a face that matched the photograph exactly. My colleagues began experiencing escalations as well. Whispers in empty rooms, personal items moved or hidden, the overwhelming sense of being watched, followed, studied. We were the patients now, under observation by something that knew the hospital better than we ever could. I've submitted my resignation, effective immediately, the administrator asked, with obvious strain in her voice. That I reconsider. Night shift workers are increasingly hard to retain. I almost told her why. Almost showed her the photograph I'd smuggled out from the abandoned floor. But the expression in Thomas Winters' eyes stopped me. Some presences don't want to be exposed. Some secrets prefer to remain in the shadows, watching new staff come and go, claiming the hospital corridors as their eternal domain. I'm leaving St. Mercy tonight, but as I pack my belongings in the staff lodging, I can't shake the feeling that part of this place is coming with me. A weight on my shoulders, a presence just behind me, and the terrible certainty that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The silence in the countryside has a weight to it. Not the comforting quiet of solitude, but the suffocating stillness of being watched. I first felt it the moment we arrived at my uncle's farmhouse. That prickling sensation between my shoulder blades, like invisible fingers tracing the knobs of my spine. The old property had been abandoned for 15 years, yet something about it felt inhabited. My cousins Anthony and Mark dismissed my unease as city boy nerves. We were there to assess the property for sale, not to indulge in paranoia. Still, when the wind whispered through the tall grass surrounding the weathered farmhouse, it carried whispers that sounded almost like words. On our second afternoon, while clearing overgrown brush, Anthony mentioned the barn, standing at the edge of the property line. It was barely visible from the house, half swallowed by encroaching forest. The structure leaned precariously, its red paint long faded to the color of dried blood. According to family stories, my uncle rarely ventured there, even when he lived on the property. When asked why, he'd mutter something about respecting boundaries and change the subject. Naturally, we decided to explore it that evening. The barn door protested loudly as Mark forced it open, the rusted hinges screaming like they were warning us away. Dust particles swirled in the beams of our flashlights, creating halos that danced like miniature galaxies in the stagnant air. The main floor was disappointingly ordinary. Old farm equipment, rotting hay bales, mouse droppings. I was about to suggest we head back when Anthony called out from behind a stack of crates. He'd found a narrow staircase leading to what appeared to be a modified loft. The steps groaned beneath our weight as we ascended, each creak sending vibrations through my body. At the top was a small room that made no architectural sense. It seemed larger inside than the barn's exterior would allow. The space was dominated by religious artifacts. Dozens of plaster saints with blank, staring eyes stood in uneven rows along the walls and were piled haphazardly in corners. Between them, shelves sagged under the weight of decomposing religious texts, their pages black with mold and age. Mark let out a low whistle, remarking that it looked like someone had robbed a church. Anthony began examining the statues, noting how the paint had chipped away to reveal crude craftsmanship beneath. I approached the books, my fingers hovering over their ruined spines. One fell open at my touch, releasing a cloud of spores that smelled of incense and rot. The visible text wasn't in English or any language I recognized. The symbols seemed to shift when viewed directly, stabilizing only in my peripheral vision. My skin grew cold despite the stuffy heat. Something about this collection felt wrong, not just abandoned, but deliberately hidden. I suggested we leave, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. My cousins reluctantly agreed after Anthony pocketed a small medallion he'd found among the debris, ignoring my protests. That night, the whispering started. I awoke at 3:17 a.m., according to the glowing digits of my phone. The farmhouse was silent, except for a soft, rhythmic murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained to listen, my heartbeat accelerating as I recognized the cadence of Latin, a language I didn't speak but could identify from years of watching historical documentaries. The words were unintelligible, but carried a hypnotic quality that made my thoughts swim and my vision blur. When I finally gained the courage to wake my cousins, they heard nothing. Anthony suggested I'd been dreaming, but the sweat soaking my shirt and the trembling in my hands told a different story. The following evening, we were grilling on the back porch when Mark spotted them, pinpricks of golden light weaving between the distant trees near the barn. They moved with deliberate purpose, sometimes blinking out only to reappear closer to the property. Anthony insisted they were just fireflies, but fireflies don't move in perfect geometric patterns, and they don't pulse in synchronized rhythm like a silent chorus. My mouth went dry as paper as we watched the lights gradually approach. Mark suggested investigating, but my legs had turned to concrete. Something primitive inside me knew that walking toward those lights would be inviting something ancient and hungry into our lives. We retreated inside, locking doors and windows despite the sweltering heat. Around midnight, I heard Anthony curse from the living room. He'd been looking out the window and called us over, his voice tight with controlled panic. In the moonlit yard stood one of the saint statues from the barn, a faceless Madonna with arms outstretched toward the house. None of us had moved it. None of us had even touched it. We argued in harsh whispers about what to do. Mark wanted to drive into town immediately. Anthony, attempting bravado, suggested smashing the statue. I couldn't take my eyes off it, certain that when I blinked, its position shifted slightly, like a cosmic game of red light, green light. The temperature in the house plummeted. My breath fogged in front of my face as Anthony finally admitted he'd taken more than just the medallion. He'd also pocketed one of the smaller statues, a cherub with an enigmatic smile. It now sat on the coffee table, and I could have sworn its smile had widened. The droning Latin chanting returned, louder now, emanating from the walls themselves. The lights from the forest had multiplied and surrounded the house, pulsing in time with the chanting. My vision tunneled, sweat freezing on my skin despite my racing heart pumping fire through my veins. Mark was the first to notice that all the statues from the barn were now arranged in a perfect circle around the house, dozens of weathered, watching sentinels. Their blank eyes weren't blank anymore. They glowed with the same golden light as the forest anomalies. We made a desperate plan. At dawn, we would run for the car and never return. But dawn never seemed to come. The night stretched endlessly as we huddled together, watching the statues inch closer whenever we weren't looking directly at them. The chanting grew louder until it rattled the windows. The Latin words, suddenly, terrifyingly comprehensible to me, though I'd never studied the language. They were calling someone home. I realized then that we weren't dealing with haunted objects. We were dealing with something that had used these objects as anchors, as eyes, something that had been watching this property, waiting for someone to disturb its vigil, something that had finally found what it was looking for, in me. I feel it now, crawling beneath my skin like static electricity, whispering that I've always belonged here, that I've finally come home. My cousins don't see the resemblance, but I do. My face reflected in the eroded features of the largest saint, standing directly before the door, waiting for me to accept its invitation. The first time I heard it was at 3:17 a.m., that distinct creak of hinges that haven't been oiled in years. Open, close, open, close, like someone indecisively peering out from inside. By the third night, I knew exactly which door it was, the hallway closet, with the vintage brass handle that always felt unnaturally cold to the touch, even on the warmest days. But each time I'd rush out to catch whatever was causing the noise, the hallway would be empty, silent, mocking my growing paranoia. I'd been living in the apartment for just 2 weeks when my roommate Eliza first mentioned seeing something. She came into the kitchen one morning, her face drained of color, hands trembling as she poured her coffee. Without looking at me, she described how she'd seen a tall, gaunt figure emerge from the closet and simply pass through the wall opposite as if it were made of fog. I laughed it off, suggesting she'd been working too many night shifts. In truth, my spine had turned to ice at her words. The building manager wasn't forthcoming when I casually inquired about the previous tenant. His eyes darted away as he mumbled something about a sudden relocation for work. When pressed, he became visibly uncomfortable, mentioning only that the man had left in such a hurry that he'd abandoned most of his possessions. The management had cleared everything out except for the clothes in the hallway closet, which they intended to donate. Those clothes, dark, expensive suits and dress shirts, all precisely the same size, all hanging with meticulous care. I found myself avoiding opening that closet, developing an irrational fear of those empty garments suspended in perfect stillness. Sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I could swear they swayed slightly, as if recently disturbed, though no windows were open and the air was still. The noises grew more frequent, no longer just at night, but at odd hours of the day, always when I was alone. Open, close, open, close. My heartbeat would accelerate with each creak, sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill that seemed to radiate from that section of the hallway. My mouth would go dry, and my hands would tremble so badly I'd have to grip the nearest piece of furniture to steady them. I began researching the building's history, uncovering nothing unusual until I found a small news article from 14 months ago. A local businessman, Jonathan Mercer, had been reported missing by his colleagues after failing to appear at an important presentation. The police had found no signs of foul play at his residence, described as an upscale apartment in the Eastern District. The article mentioned that his personal items remained undisturbed, as if he'd simply vanished while going about his routine. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake, ears straining for that telltale sound, muscles tense to spring from bed at the first creak. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with endless corridors of identical closets, each containing a single suspended suit that turned to watch me as I passed. Eliza moved out after a month, claiming the apartment's energy was affecting her health. She didn't need to explain. I'd seen how she'd grown pale and withdrawn, how she'd taken to pressing herself against the opposite wall whenever she had to pass the closet. Before leaving, she admitted she'd heard whispers coming from behind that door, soft, urgent murmurings in a language she couldn't identify. I began finding anomalies, items relocated from where I'd left them, indentations on the couch when I returned from work, as if someone had been sitting there, a persistent cologne scent that wasn't mine lingering in the bathroom. Most disturbing was the morning I discovered one of the suits had been removed from its hanger and carefully folded on my bed. My hands shook violently as I returned it to the closet, my breath coming in shallow gasps, cold sweat trickling down my back. I considered burning the clothes, but couldn't bring myself to touch them again. Instead, I sealed the closet door shut with duct tape, creating an X across its frame. That night, the creaking was replaced by a powerful pounding from within, so forceful that the tape began to tear. My heart hammered against my ribs in matching rhythm, my vision blurring at the edges as I backed away down the hall. I could feel each pulse of blood through my temples, could hear my own ragged breathing competing with the relentless thudding against wood. By morning, the tape was intact, unmarred. I questioned my sanity, wondering if stress had finally broken something essential within my mind. But the chill that emanated from the door was undeniable, as was the faint scent of that unfamiliar cologne that now permeated the entire apartment. I found my answer 3 days later, when curiosity and desperation drove me to pry up the floorboards in the closet. Beneath them was a small leather portfolio containing property documents, a deed to the apartment in Jonathan Mercer's name. According to these papers, he had never sold the place. Legally, he still owned it, still owned the space I had been occupying. That realization brought surprising calm. The physical symptoms of terror subsided into a dull acceptance as I understood the truth. I wasn't the tenant here. I was the intruder. Now, I leave the closet door open at night. I've moved his suits to the bedroom, hung them neatly in my own closet. Sometimes I catch glimpses of him in reflective surfaces, a tall figure in an immaculate suit, watching me with patient eyes. He never speaks, never threatens. He simply observes as I gradually move my possessions out, making room for his return. Tomorrow I'll inform the building manager I'm breaking my lease. I won't explain why. As for Mercer, I believe he just wants his home back. After all, even those who vanish from this world may not be ready to leave it entirely behind.